chiseled muscles, so it kills me to say it. No to the Washington Redskins quarterback, RG3, and his remarkable poise in the pocket, if you know what I mean. And no to Precious, that controversial big black body moving slowly on the cinema screen, unless she is running while eating fried chicken she's just stolen and that she's going to hurl. What am I saying? Simply this. The images of black folks in this country, the visual renderings of their bodies in and around President Obama may seem stuck, seem penned in, not quite able to escape the confines of the sticky racial cartoons that lie in wait for them, unless those bodies are firmly middle class, Michelle Obama, and even then. In what ways has visual culture let us down, even as it's spawning new and liquid forms, ones that Kathy is tracking and making her luminous work from, as we've seen? Yes, there are benefits of really silly films, as Jack has brilliantly shoved on our plates. I love how Jack shoves. And there are benefits of quite troubling popular films, like Pulp Fiction, even like Precious, if we surgically dissect and open them to their most radical possible possibilities. At least I've thought so. At least I've said so, with the help of Duke. But here's the challenge to my work from Sharon's book. How much silliness or sophistication can we afford when we're fighting racist powers? What kind of text, Angel Hayes, can get at the intimate sexual dimensions of racism running right under our noses? Sharon herself ends her book with Faulkner. And another question to me specifically, has my work, and work like mine, sped through racism all too quickly to embrace shame? To pull the kind of queer move that moves queers, moves many queers, moves this queer. Cozy up to shame. Make something of it, since you're soaking in it. Let Toni Morrison and Mapplethorpe guide you. Go big, go long, as quarterbacks put it. Be eventful, in your face. In fact, displace the face, as I'm exploring in my work, as I'll explain. But I'm losing faith, questioning my faith. That's why I'm here. Why I'm reading Sharon, why I'm shoved by Jack, why I'm seeking Marlon. I want to talk with others, I want to talk with you about visual culture and the faith I've placed in complicated films and fictions without pictures. So let me state the matter as I pose it to myself for a long time now. I have told myself we must attract people to a problem. How do we attract people to poverty as an issue? How do we make sexy the differential unemployment circumstance for blacks? Do we need to? Do we need to make it sensual to probe the problem of access to literacy? How do we seductively show not obvious visible racism, since it shows itself, but the kind that hides in front of our eyes, the kind that is killing people slowly over time? And how do we keep libidinal pleasure tethered to these questions, so we don't produce bleached and sanitized anti-sex solutions for adults and children? I want to scout these issues via 3 examples from my past and present research. One from a novel, one from a blockbuster art house film, and one from a novel that became a film. Now I should say you might have a handout maybe on your chair. Do you have one? I'm going old school here. I have a little problem with my visual track. So take the handout as an analogized form to the visual track. At any rate, you won't be lost without it, but nonetheless. Be warned in what I'll say. I'm going to link Morrison to Tarantino. I'm going to praise push and make a swirly case for Precious, don't stone me yet, by finding invisible libidinal poems hiding inside Black Girl Fat. But it's visible hiddenness I'm finding. Manifest latency. Latency now. If so much of everyday racism hides itself in daylight, I'm a theorist of visible hiddenness, which is to say maybe still claustrophilic. I'll leave that for you to decide. And Sharon is mentoring me anew in her new book, almost explaining my research to me. You know how books can do that? Sharon makes sense of why Toni Morrison has been, for me, a theorist. So actually, I'm hoping one effect of Sharon's book is going to be for researchers who've already written things to actually reframe their thoughts, actually understand new angles of what they were up to. So that's part of what I'm trying to do here. Okay. Here's what I found in Morrison, really at the dawn of my young career. This was 1989. I was a child, I tell you, a mere child. At that time, I was trying to shock my students with what they didn't see. The place of racism in queer lives, especially in Utah, with its many shades of whiteness and increasing numbers of people of color, many of whom themselves are religious. Where could we get started in provoking ourselves? So I decided to write a book on the presumed space between the signifiers black and queer, and theorize something I call the switch point. And the switch point is simply the point of connection between two signs. So really trying to understand what is the logic when they come together, what logic is produced, where something, some sort of meaning and connotative field flows into the scene of another, is diverted towards another. And what happens there for me with meaning is meanings are illuminated, they're intensified, they are wonderfully adulterated, and they are miscegenated. And I think Sharon is really raising the ante on theorizing something like the switch point. I also chose with students to scout the dangers along with the beauties of embracing shame. I wanted then, in 1989, to test the limits of Versani and his followers and my own embrace of loss. Now, it must sound odd that this questioning had to be textually driven in my environment, but let me tell you, I needed students to be attractive, and I used Morrison's seductions to seduce. What were her seductions? In her novel Sula, she used black girls and the sexual glue bonding them as she made a fiction in which black women are the anal penetrators of black men so as to get at problems of black unemployment. As Sharon might point out, there's nothing static here about black, female, queer, right? The circuits of sex and desire in Morrison are not autonomous, but are tethered to a matrix of contemporary problems of national concern. So here was Toni Morrison's flirtation with shame. As if shame holds seductive qualities she would release. For so importantly in this novel, making it perfect for our Utah context, Morrison draws on Christian theology's central tenet. What the world puts low, God raises high. What the world deems debased, God elevates. But her challenge to this simplistic view, and here she collars Christians, is to run this doctrine around the rectum, around the literal and metaphorical rims of a set of black bottoms. She directly tests the extent to which blacks before civil rights could afford any forms of pleasurable loss, Bersani style, could afford a kind of bottom theology, a kind of celebration of divine debasement. And thus she succeeds in displaying a tangle, something hard to see until you know it's there. It goes like this. Reaching bottom is theologically encouraged, sexually pleasurable, but economically dangerous for marginalized people. My students could see this, finally, palpably. We couldn't help but notice that the place where the Negroes live in the novel is called the bottom, despite the fact that it's up in the hills, away from fertile land. Why put the bottom up? And why surround this bottom with striking anal imagery? So let me just give you a few examples to prove my point. I'm skipping a scene here in which an unemployed black man sees his reflection in the toilet bowl's water, all right? So here are three central scenes. In a central scene, a black mother, Eva, takes her baby to an outhouse because his boy stopped having bowel movements. He can't produce due to the family's lack of money. First, she shoves the last bit of food she has in the world up his ass, providing him with an anal feeding. Then she softens her finger with a dab of lard and penetrates his bottom to free his stools. What a weird phrase. That are so hard they ricochet like pebbles on the ground. The chapter ends with the death of this boy after he's become a man. In a different scene, two young black girls, Nell and Sula, accidentally kill a young black boy, and the death occurs after the girls have a curious scene with twigs. They are described as undressing thick twigs and poking them rhythmically and intensely into the ground, making a hole in which they stuff all the small defiling things they could find, bits of glass and cigarette butts. The narrator calls this hole, this kind of anus, this kind of waste receptacle in the ground, a grave. It is as if they have built a bottom in which to tuck a boy they accidentally kill in the very next scene. And yet another moment from Sula's adulthood, her orgasm is rendered as a kind of anality, one in touch with excrement or beautiful dirt. In fact, we're told that sex for her is a way of feeling sorrow, of going down howling in a stinging awareness of the ending of things. Very Bersani-like on one level. But in this scene, she imagines that during sex, as she sits atop her lover, she is using a chisel to penetrate his surface, at which point she narrates, "Through the breaks, I will see the loam, fertile, free of pebbles and twigs. I will put my hand deep into your soil, lift it, sift it with my fingers." What does this mean? We couldn't really tell, but what we could glean were echoes of those earlier scenes of penetrations. Eva freeing her baby's stools, hard as pebbles, Nell and Sula probing the ground with their unpressed twigs. But this scene's siftings, we concluded, transformed those earlier scenes of desperation. Think of Angel Hayes, suggesting something languorous, sensuous, and sumptuous to this penetration of a man's soil. Something here that makes a black man productive of and also alive to bottom values. As Angel Hayes might put it, this shit is what you make it. Indeed, I wanted my students to grasp Toni Morrison's uniqueness as a theorist, as a queer theorist, through her supreme use of anal imagery to theorize black economic crimes. We saw this by putting her conceptions next to Freud's, next to his claim that civilized development, moral progress through sublimation, requires one to leave one's bottom behind, so that the urge to make money can replace anality. But as my students see, Morrison refuses the civilized goals of sublimation, as she unambiguously values the life of her black bottom neighborhood, and values those women who, like Sula, psychically retain the pleasures of dirt into adulthood. And it is the impotence of Freudian theory to explain the anal imagery of Sula that shows the brilliance of Morrison's using the bottom to explore the knotted relationship of black men and women to capitalist economies from 1919 to 1965. Especially the way black labor history, especially the history of black men's unemployment, precisely reverses Freud's expectations about masculinity's linked to activity and femininity's linked to passivity. And of course, if there were time, I would show you how this ends up addressing the famous Moynihan Report from 1965, Robert Staples' treatise on black masculinity, Angela Davis, Hortense Spillers talking about black women's labor activity, and more than 40 years of reporting in Time magazine and Newsweek on the black problem of the female-headed home. Something repeated in this very campaign, Mr. Santorum. But let me say what my students learn to see. They see how this novel reveals that the prejudice against queer anality and against its pleasures oddly speaks as a kind of off-rhyme to the stigma of people who live at the bottom of an economic scale. And more radically, they see Morrison using depictions of the body's bottoms, its struggles for production, and its surprising capacities for pleasure, even its fertility of a queer sort, to redirect the pun of an economic bottom without erasing the force of its stigma. It's very hard to do. To show the bottom as something more than an economic seller. To show what kind of beauty or odd communal tenderness sits beside, has sat beside, black's financial sorrows. Not that Sula can solve the problems it shows hiding, but look at how black queer signifiers cross and mate at a crux. If upward mobility is theologically and sexually depleting in this novel, but downward mobility spells suicide for economically marginalized people, what economy will not immobilize? Can there be a rising without one's leaving one's bottom behind? That's the question for this very moment, it seems to me. Okay, that's Morrison, a feminist theorist, a black queer theorist, maybe we could say. But what does her aggressive portrait of the bottom have to do with Pulp Fiction and the broader problem of visual culture I'm concerned about? Largely this. If you told me that she, not Tarantino, had written the movie's screenplay, I think I would have bought it. It displays a trenchant engagement of racism that is strongly tethered to upsetting pleasures, making these two matters intimate, erotic, provocative of questions about the force of visuals and their redemptions, to use a loaded term my students like. Okay, So what I want you to do is to listen in this section for a key Sharon Holland point. Sharon is telling us we cannot think of slavery as a legacy for blacks. It is a central legacy for every American, and probably quite beyond that, but nonetheless. So what do I focus on in Pulp Fiction? 3 pulpy sites. You can check your Pulp Fiction memory here. The anal rape of the black drug lord Marcellus Wallace by a pair of lecherous redneck whites. The blowing off of Marvin's black preppy face when the gun of Vince goes off in the car. And White Mia's resurrection. Remember, she's the white wife of the raped drug lord, right? And she's a key part of this messy materiality, as Sharon would say. Mia's resurrection due to the hypodermic needle that is jabbed into her chest to save her from her lethal cocaine overdose. So Mia's resurrection, a black man's anal rape, the blowing off of a black man's face. These are visuals that viewers remember, as if they themselves have been shot in the eyes. And indeed, every viewer in this film is shot in the eyes. Yet even queer critics critique the site of the anal rape on race-sex grounds due to its violence and intense sexual objectification. As I tell my students, you're not alone in objecting to these scenes. In fact, as analogy, we delve into black queer critics' passionate complaints against Robert Mapplethorpe, against his objectifying black nude men in his erotically provocative photographs. So I was going to copy for you, but fear of copyright laws detained me. So here's from my book. That's the Robert Mapplethorpe hooded man, beautiful black male body with a hood over the head. Okay, very striking, potentially upsetting image. I suggest to them that the beauty of this protest by black queer men is the way we see repulsion and political anger turning into confessions of attraction. For the black queers who railed against Mapplethorpe began to admit that they were sexually drawn to these images. Though they were offended, they were attracted, and thus had to face how fascinating, angering photographs were wounding them while also seducing them. So let me say again, Pulp Fiction shoots every viewer's face. And I remind students of what they've read in Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, but perhaps haven't noticed. His rhetoric of violence for his passion for photography. As he puts it, I wanted to explore photography not as a question, but as a wound. Hence, a photographic detail that attracts him he calls a punctum. As Barthes says, it rises from the scene, shoots out of it like an arrow, and pierces me. A photograph's punctum is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me. In this sense, Mapplethorpe's nudes, even Tarantino's scene of anal rape, prick the eye, bruising every viewer to the point of poignancy, at least possibly. And Tarantino cranks this dynamic. He tucks into the site of the rape the quasi-hidden histories of national debasements. We are in the basement of the Mason-Dixon pawn shops being places for redemption, for redeeming possessions. A big black man is being wounded from behind by redneck whites, a scene reminiscent from Jim Crow history and gay porn. The man who stops the rape, but doesn't block his sight from piercing our eyes, cuts one redneck right in two before this savior escapes on Grace, the name, it happens, of the motorcycle chopper he escapes on. And most importantly, after this scene of anal rape and escape on Grace, the film starts to show us what it's been hiding in its cuts by looping us back to earlier scenes that were cut from our view. The blowing off of a black man's face with attempts to hide his body, a hiding that we see, and the hitmen's discussions of a miracle. My points are these. Visually, the film hides discussions of redemption inside cuts. Cuts to the body, cuts to the eye, cuts in the film, so as to show entire histories that lie tucked inside key signs, which at any moment can spring into action. Talk about the psychic continuum of racism, which Sharon stresses. For the film suggests that wounds, once they are suffered, cannot be undone. Not the historical rape of black people, not our site of rape, not the blowing off of a black man's face. They, like cuts, can only be opened and given further layers. This is the orthodox view of redemption. It is often a violent non-equivalence between two different actions at two different times inside one sign. One form of violence, Christ on the cross, pays the price for prior violence, human forms of sin. Layer them, add them, you have redemption. Thus, our forced attraction to pulpy, wounding details in Pulp Fiction can be our way of doing sorrow, political meditation, visual fascination, sexual stimulation, and black humor all at once, since redemption is all about additions at the scene of the violence of signs. But here's the problem. I'm sure you've been feeling it. Look at all the verbiage it took just now to release the radical anti-racist dynamics of these fictions. Sula works pretty well on its own. It doesn't need help, but it is intricate. Tarantino's film, by contrast, seems racist if you don't untangle it. Swing now to Precious. Not a dense film. An Oprah Tyler Perry number. What can this film bring to our eyes? What forms of hiddenness sit on its surface? Now, for one moment, hold these questions and step back. I want to say some words about my new project on poverty and sexuality and the queer intercourse that connects them, often via sexual children. So there are three things I'm trying to accomplish, and Sharon's aims are all over them. So one, I'm trying to criticize world documentaries on children in peril by using African American fictions of sexual children. Even though a la Jack, I would say this is a transnational project. So I'd sort of go back in Jack's direction and saying I think the transnational force of this project weds itself also back to the Black binary. Two, I'm crafting through these fictions new theoretical thoughts on latency, particularly children's agency in latency, something I'm calling manifest latency. So in other words, here I'm really trying to theorize from Black bodies to a generalized problem, all right? Not particularity, but to generality. And three, I'm returning to the question of praxis in the face of poverty, asking what our theories ask us to do. So I'll give you a hint. I'm actually trying to reconcile the aims of Queers for Economic Justice with queer theory's embrace of the death drive. Fool that I am. All right, but that's another day. Grounding my project is my suspicion that in the U.S. we're in a new twilight period of a gathering belief in a fearful sense of sexual children. So as I think we're having kind of a culture moment where we're going, uh-oh, maybe children are more sexual than we thought. We've got gay kids coming out in middle school. We've got sexual bullying, right? We've got child-teen sexting. We've got all these things that we can't really continue to pretend are not happening. And what I think it's forcing now is for the public to try to locate, to rediscover its lost child in some other land. Therefore, I think we are busy about exporting our lost child, the figure of the innocent child, to foreign land where it seems available to be rediscovered in inverted form. All right? So this is actually a whole theory that I have on kid Orientalism, which I basically argue is anti-Orientalism, except it actually spawns a new Orientalism. I can tell you more about that later. What I want you to notice here is that visual representation really matters on this front. It's the chief way most people have access to children in peril outside the U.S. But oh, the paradoxes, as I'll now suggest. So come back to Push and Precious. Picture for a moment a large black girl, pregnant by her father for now the second time, infected by him with HIV, abused by her mother, and functionally illiterate. That is, picture Precious, the child protagonist of the novel Push by the poet Sapphire, which became the movie entitled Precious when it hit the screen in 2009. On screen, these matters are carried by BAM, an image sequence out of nowhere, hitting film viewers upside their heads. The mother throws an object at her daughter's skull. Cut to sweaty father loosening his belt. Precious on bed now. View of bed springs, creaking, rocking. Eggs are sizzling and grease in a pan. Vaseline, rape. Precious launching fantasy of herself as movie star, sashaying down an expanse of red carpet. You can surely see how viewers of this film might despise this film. Might despise the terms of this film as melodramatic, over-the-top, possibly campy, sensational renderings of sexual harm. I see why. See their power to repel. But I'd like the film to pivot on the novel, to see if there are currents that run against repulsion. Strikingly, for all of this sexual sensation, novel and film smartly depict how this abuse interferes with literacy, how this sexual abuse is matched by state neglect of children's education. And as I suggest, how a girl's longing, her sexual agency, comes out on paper as a form of latency, her fierce longing to produce poetry of all the luxuries. Thus, in the character of Precious are dramatized the sexual and economic politics and passion of children's latent relationships with signifiers. And again, think about what Jack showed us in Angel Hayes. Latent, here's just the dictionary definition. Latent, present or potential, but not manifest, says the dictionary. As in latent talent, latent sexuality, latent meaning, or latent period, the incubation period of a disease. But latent to whom? Manifest to whom? Precious sees dormancy and speaks to it longingly, making scenes of vacancy secretly jeweled with growth and fertility. With death lurking, while she's getting bigger, deep in her pregnancy and HIV, Precious longs for poetry. She would write poems. But what does it mean for a character who narrates throughout the whole novel how she is emerging into literacy via her passion and struggle for language? Sapphire's Precious character is something really rare. She's the imagined voice of a latency. This is a truly impossible voice as it sits on the page of the novel's start, even inside the novel's own terms, since it is a written voice that tells how it's emerging into written signs, as if latency could speak and write itself so that we could hear it. Precious as a character is a tonal stack, a range of tones, a layering of tones that express latency, fitting for the concept of a sexual child. And an HIV child, since HIV can be a latency between infection and manifest symptoms. The child with a signifier, HIV, signifying sex or drugs or blood and often race, is a sexualized child in a racialized world, a child with a bomb that may go off inside. And indeed, I'm working with peculiar paradoxes. Now I'm going to push towards the end. I'm just going to say two things here for you to listen to. Part of what I'm arguing is that in the U.S. context, the black HIV child is almost always a threatening child. Whereas if you just move that child overseas and make a world documentary about that child is somehow the innocent child. Both black children infected with HIV. So let me just briefly make my point. You got your handout. I'm just going to point you to one quotation here. Around the time of PUSH in 1996, almost half of United States HIV children were growing up with AIDS and HIV, living with and through their viral infection, which was making them strangely threatening. And oh, by the way, mostly the focus is on the black child, who is the face of the HIV child. So I've got two quotations there. I'm just going to point you to the second one. I just want you to hear the New York Times talking about this, okay? So this is a quote from 1999. Here we're meeting a black boy and his siblings. Now, instead of planning funerals, says the Times, parents worry that their children's behavior could hurt them, and, if unprotected sex is involved, others. These parents thought the child was going to die, explains the medical director. There's ambivalence that the kids are doing well. They have invested so much to try to keep the kids healthy, and now the kids are taking their fate into their own hands. They're making risky choices. Here, evidently, is a latency scarier than HIV. The manifest latency, the not-so-latent latency of child sexuality that U.S. culture is being forced to reckon with ever more steadily. So what about the urge to film the child in peril in various places around the globe? This will sound outlandish and sound more intentional than it can be. But new documentaries on the child in crisis in India, Malawi, Uganda, depicting children in peril by sex trade, civil war, and AIDS, are for many viewers relocating our Western-style innocent child to foreign soil where it can strangely be rediscovered. That is, it can appear that these urgent films, through a loving backslap, grant their child protagonists the privilege of weakness, generally the province of the white middle class, that only these children's extraordinary peril can produce. So, paradoxically, through available forms of disavowal, where we deny what we know to be true, we look for our child, our disappearing child, the child who needs protection, the child who wants protection, Where we should know, where we do know, the Western child on its long delay cannot be found. Take Madonna's art house documentary, I Am Because We Are, 2008, focusing on children orphaned by AIDS, infected by AIDS in the African country, Malawi. Now I'm going to give you the least sophisticated example because these documentaries are actually really sophisticated, but they all hit the same brick wall. So I'm just sort of illustrating it with the most obvious example here. In her film, Madonna connects all human experience through the suffering figure of the child, whom she presumes we at once recognize. But this is not our innocent child, nor is this our troubling child who is taking her fate into her hands. This, I suspect, is our troubling child with its suffering turned back upon its head, where its harm can act like a wash, soaping, rinsing, buffing suffering into a sheen we can read as weakness and thus as innocence. This is how we get this platonic child, a child preserved in amber, fossilized or etherized, but breathing and living in Malawi all along, we're led to believe. Someone requiring no translation because we've known this child in Washington or Paris. Aren't these the fears and hopes of any child, Madonna asks, after her film has shown us a context that bears scant resemblance to anything we've known, if we are not Malawians or those who know Malawi? Where the film instructs us 1 million children orphaned by AIDS out of the country's 12 million people seem to be everywhere, quote, living on the streets, sleeping under bridges, hiding in buildings, being abducted, kidnapped, raped, circumstances leading to a state of emergency, end quote. Most perversely, it is these very differences in the lives of children, which Madonna shows but fails to see as different, that make Malawi's children, at least for Madonna, uber candidates for the Western-style innocent child who above all needs our protection. A flattened version of U.S. childhood, one we've had to start doubting ourselves, is thus magically restored on foreign soil through, of all things, the sexualized, racialized HIV child. Here's a dilemma for visualization. In the end, Madonna's film cannot produce an image I haven't seen all of my life, though I've never seen these specific children. I mean that famous African image nearly every viewer will know from CARE or UNICEF ads since their childhood. A glossy reproduction of a glassy stare in high definition. Completely strange to say, each child's face makes me not see the child I am viewing. I can't see these children because these children are blocking my view of them, themselves. This grim tautology meets and defeats my gaze at every turn, making me try as Madonna's viewer to do an impossible visual maneuver, stiff-arm the image, stiff-arm the child, so as to slip behind its face, to see around what the image is showing me and not telling me. What does it mean in this country for so many children to wear, in their illness or their orphanhood, a sexual and sexually stigmatizing sign, HIV/AIDS, which is highly stigmatizing in their country? How do they think about it? What would they say about it? There's a world of signification lurking here, but this is all we get. What does it have to do with Precious in the end? The answer lies in part in this girl's passion for signification, for signs that give voice to several kinds of latency, talent, disease, and sexuality, and most profoundly, of meaning itself. I will even claim that as Sapphire has arranged it, Precious writes poetry akin to Ezra Pound's in William Carlos Williams, poems hiding in plain daylight on the unencumbered surface of language. Williams, you may know, famously stated that he made poems from the speech of Polish mothers. Or, as Precious writes in one of her poems, turning her sexual imagination into a broader embrace of possibility, downtown, sky open, blue legs for sun. Somehow, poetry, HIV, and childhood share key concepts at their core. Moreover, as they combine in Precious, they contradict a frail, bruised innocence. In an edgy line, speaking of abuse, she stacks these tones. Speaking of her father, first he mess up my life fucking me, then he mess up the fucking talking. Thus, in a way that Sharon may appreciate, Precious is an antidote to a certain strain of world documentaries. She even shows, one last paradox, that so far documentaries of living children capture less of children than do fictions of fictionalized children. which takes us now to fat, which is where I'll end. It's my last paragraph. What in the world can the film Precious possibly accomplish, given that two indispensable features of the novel disappear? Precious's poems and her rendering of sexual longing. How can this film do anything but fail, given these holes? Indeed, it's been loathed by all kinds of critics. I can show, via sharp dissection, that the tones of the poems are hiding in the fat, making for strangely lyrical fat. Fascinating sets of repeating elements in this film move in and out of adipose tissue, making for a set of accumulated tones, a tonal stack, but here through sight, layering, playing against the worn notion of personal expression so as to voice what is on the move, what is latent, what is now. Balled together, here are contentious connotations of physical power and invisibility. A bodily fortress, that is a prison, open to invasions by rape and grease, a strange invasive pair, all stacking tones of anger, loneliness, muffled longing, mumbled protest, and a kind of hope buried under outgrowths that, like fat, would take intensive time to solve. There are remarkable syntagmatic chains to be found in single scenes, revealing how associations slide sideways on the back of fat, tying together the factors of literacy, sexuality, state neglect, and child abuse. I could show you, I insist, but who cares? The fat falls flat. The weight of the history of depictions of black women crushes micro-visual textures that could be telling. Hence, on this front of the sexualized, racialized HIV child, we are thrown back to fictional pages and their sonic properties, left to choose perhaps between the impossible loquacious child of Push and a set of visualized children whose images block our sight of them. Oh, if we could gaga that. And so I pray to Jack, shower us with angel dust. We could use some haze. Thank you for your patience.